Oh, let's point that in the right direction. Let's point that in the right direction. Let's point me in the right direction. Oops. 9 kinds of buggery. It's bad enough I have to do this stuff, but I also then every time I change, I have to hear my own little weird noises again. It's so disturbing. Keeps restarting the video. Okay, now no, we're all here. Hang on. Okay, I think we're there. Does that mean we're there? I think we're there. All right, so say goodbye to that. Say hello to this, and here we are. Hooray, hello. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. And isn't it an amazing world in which we can actually say things like that while on camera? I mean, I realize it's been true ever since I was a kid, or even a bit earlier, but it still never ceases to amaze me that we can all share so many things in so many ways, horrors and wonders and everything in between, including a plain old reading session and saying hi to people. So, hello, Kenneth. I see that you're there. Hello. Hi, Becca. Carl, hi. Hello. Jerry, good to see you, bud. Nina, why am I live? Hi, Nina. If you look in the comments section, you'll see a comment from Nina Kariki Hoffman, one of the world's great living short story writers, and somebody that I am pleased to say helped me on one of my books. Together we expanded my book, or my long short story, Child of an Ancient City. And I think a case could be made that Nina's stuff may have been the best thing in the revised and expanded edition. But any which way, she's a wonderful writer. And if you don't know Nina's work, you should go find some right now. Hi, Nina. Why am I live? I do this every Sunday at 2 a.m. in the morning for the European folks and overseas crowds, depending on where they all live. And then 7 p.m. for my more local folk. So anyway, that's why I'm live. I'm live every Sunday, twice a day. And I'm reading books. Tonight I'm reading from War of the Flowers, which we've been working on for some weeks. I'm reading my books because it's a lot easier than trying to get permission for everything else. Although that may change one of these days. At some point I may either tire of reading my own stuff, the Vox Populi may tell me in no uncertain terms to shut up and stop, or I may have to start reading other people's things, or maybe I will convert at least one of my programs into a show, and we'll have people like Nina on to talk to us and share stuff and tell stories and stuff. So that might be fun. I could do a sort of a Jack Parr, Dick Cavett, kind of Chuckles the Clown sort of thing. I would be Chuckles, obviously. Anyway, so that's why, Nina, and lovely to see you. And I miss you. I only ever get to see you for brief moments at conventions, and that's never enough. Matthew, hello, Matthew. Jerry says, don't point at me. I will point at you anytime I want to. Yeah, there, I did it again. Emily, hello, Emily. Good to see you, and thank you for your kind words. Pierre, hello, Pierre. Good evening to you, too. Sherry, hi, Sherry. Could I point you in the right direction, too? I don't know if I'm really the person anybody wants to have pointing them anywhere, because I can barely find my way around the house. But anyway. Kelly, hello, Kelly. And Melissa. And Nancy, hi, Nancy. And who else? Barb Ann. And who else who we have not said hello to? Alex. Hi, Alex. Good to see you. Anyway, Mark. Hey, Mark. Good to see you, buddy. I sent you an email a couple of weeks back. I hope you got it. Not that it was anything super significant, but I did send you an email because I wanted you to know we were thinking about you. Jeremy. There's Jeremy. And James. Hellos to you, too. And Alexis. Well, we will quietly just tiptoe past Alexis because she is violent and prone to snapping at the ankle. So just walk by, don't make eye contact. Amy, hello, Amy. And who else is here with us tonight? Because there's a big conversation going on. Sundresses? Yes, I'm wearing my sundress. Medardo, hello, Tad. My wife is better. Oh, excellent. COVID. Ooh, geez, scary. I'm very glad. So you guys take good care of each other. You're important. Don't do anything silly. And Paul, hello, Paul. That was the last one. I almost missed you there because you were tucked in under Medardo's longish tweet. So yeah, see, there's Terzian. You can't trust her. She's fierce, but you know she's tiny and vindictive as well. Anyway, okay. So have I got everything? I've got my microphone. I got my spurs that jingle, jangle, jingle. I'm going to be reading. I don't have a whole lot to say as I have been just barfing forth political commentary on my Facebook page of late, but that's not what this slot is for. So if you want to read any of the many angry, well, not just angry, I hope sensible things that we're talking about on my Facebook page and of course everywhere else in the goddamn country, please go check that out. And I'm always happy to carry on political conversations there, even if you completely disagree with me, as long as you stay relatively civil. You know, there's only been a few people who I've ever actually unfriended from social media for political stuff. One was a high school friend of mine who was a very interesting woman in a lot of ways. She was like raised by hippie parents, and yet she herself became like a super duper, really deep, what do you want to call it? Deep belief, kind of a Catholic extremist, I think. You know, one of these people who has a certain miracle thing that they're always pushing, and, you know, like, oh, and this is, you know, what's really going on in the universe, and, you know, which is fine. That's also, everybody's entitled to their opinion. But at one point during the, after the murder of Daniel, I'm ashamed I've forgotten his name, the journalist who was killed by ISIS forces, she said something like, you know, well, I wish Obama was being beheaded. And I went, sorry, you're gone. And then, you know, one or two people called me an effing libtard, you know, as part of a you know, reaction to me saying something in disagreement to them. And I just went, you know, that's not necessary. It's not the term itself. I'm proud to be a liberal humanist, a secular liberal humanist. I don't have any problems with that. I don't have problems with people being religious. That's wonderful. If it soothes you and gives you comfort and it leads you to be a better person, I'm all for it. You know, I have a different set of beliefs, but you know, nobody's right, nobody's wrong, because there is no right or wrong on these eternal issues or infinite issues. So, or at least nobody can say what's right or wrong. But in terms of, you know, don't call people ugly names. I'm just not for that. And I'm certainly not going to waste my time with people in that case, it was somebody I had indulged many, many times who was just very vituperative and super unpleasant and would say horrible things to other people on my site and me. And I just went, don't need you. That's like the only two people I can think of that I've ever actually blocked. I have, however, been blocked by many people on social media. So, clearly I'm either more of a panty waist, to use an old Ben Grimm expression from the Fantastic Four, than they are, or I'm maybe just a little more tolerant, of other people's opinions. Teresa, hey sweetie, there's my friend Teresa. Teresa is one of the world's truly fine people. Anybody who does not know her, but likes really smart, really funny, really cool people should. I've known Teresa since 1979 or 78. We worked together at a comic book store and at a radio station, and we've been friends. Well, we were friends until she met my wife, in which case I was kicked to the curb because she liked my wife better. But what can you do? Anyway, wonderful person. And I'm very pleased to see her. So, and you should go, all these people, you should all check out each other's pages. You should make yourself into an army of resistance against stupidity. Okay, so anything else I need to tell you guys, since I've already wasted a great deal of time here? No, I got some sleep last night. I feel like crap. I'm having an inflammatory thing, which is not interesting and I'm not going to bore you with, but it has cut into my joie de vivre this weekend, just a wee bit. However, much of it is restored by the knowledge of all you fine people out there. So I am glad to see you always, and I am particularly glad to see you right now when it hurts to walk up and down stairs and to sit in one position and all kinds of crap like that. I am going to continue in just a moment with War of the Flowers. I will quickly bring you up to date with all you really need to know, which was that the people among the fairy nobility, the hollyhocks, the daffodils, and various others who were helping, or at least supporting, or at least interested in not killing Theo, our protagonist. Sorry, I'm having a weird beard moment. There it goes. We're having a meeting at Daffodil House where the people who were their political enemies and Theo's blood enemies, because they're trying to kill him, as far as he can tell. The Thornapples, the Hellebores, the Foxgloves, etc., were supposed to all come together to have a meeting of the high fairy houses. Instead, as Theo was watching from a lower floor on a monitor, the Hellebore contingent not only did not show up, but what they did instead is they attacked Daffodil House with a dragon, which they had illegally and completely immorally somehow found a way to wake up, which is the equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb on your enemies. And basically all of Theo's people, as far as we know, perhaps including Count Tansy, who turned out to be, even though he was the first fairy lord who welcomed Theo to fairy, he also proved to be a traitor who was working with the Hellebore faction. Anyway, so he may have died also after trying to kidnap Theo. But definitely a whole lot of everybody else is dead too. So that happened, and that we left that in mid-catastrophe. Hello, Sonia. And that then after that, we started a new chapter, which went back to Streety Nettle, who some of you may have remember was the fairy working in the power plant, who had something strange to happen to him back near an earlier part of the book, and had the entire magical power of the power plant briefly run through him and was severely damaged by that. So we've been reading a section in which Streety, who has now some allies, we don't really know much of anything about, Streety was doing something very important for these friends of his in downtown Fairy, in the big city. And as he was on his way back from doing this and having to be very careful because he has a lot of thinking problems post his accident, he happened to be out on the streets with a lot of other people when the dragon flew over them and attacked first Daffodil House, and then apparently houses of the other fairy lords who were resisting Hellebore and his folk as well. So that's where we are. Streety has just been blown off his feet by this tremendous rush of wind and then this giant explosion as Daffodil House was destroyed by dragon fire. And that's where we're at, and that's where I'm going to continue reading. So here we go. So this is from Streety's point of view, not Theo's. Theo, as far as we know, is still back in whatever is left of Daffodil House. He was walking, although he didn't remember why. It was snowing, just like back in Hazel, which seemed wrong somehow, but there it was, a constant flutter of gray and white flakes everywhere, in the air, sifting and swirling around his feet, getting into his nose and mouth so that he could hardly breathe or see for crying. Strange snow. The street was winter dark too, but nighttime had come only in certain places, great inky clouds of blackness in front of the sun, but with bits of blue-gray sky peeping through. He didn't understand any of it. No bus had come. He couldn't remember exactly why, but everyone else had stopped waiting before he had. In fact, they had all run away, except for one of the women, who had spread her wings to fly, but she was clumsy, like she hadn't done it much, and also crying hard. She had fluttered awkwardly through the snowy wind until she ran into a wall and fell, and then didn't get up again. Streety hadn't seen a big fairy like her fly in a long time. Something really bad must have upset her. He felt he should remember what that something had been. It seemed like it was important, but he couldn't. So now he was walking, his special bag still clutched in his hand. He didn't want his friends to be upset. He hoped he was walking in the right direction. Pentacle Street? He was pretty certain that was the right name, but he had no idea if he was still on that street. He tried to ask people where he should go, but most of the folk he saw hurrying through the gray snow, some holding things over their heads to keep the stuff off, some with scarves or shirts clutched over their mouths, didn't want to stop and talk. He finally found someone, a little Farisher in a suit, who was standing on a street corner talking into a shell. Streety asked him whether he was going the right way to get to the Warstones and Dockyards bus. Warstones? The little ochre-colored man put his shell in his pocket. He laughed, but he looked like he wanted to cry. His face and suit were very dirty. He looked like the kind of person who should know Warstones, Streety thought, but the Farisher disappointed him. Cracks in the floorboard! How should I know? He wiped sweat and gray snow off his forehead, giggling. Three of the great houses, Lily, Daffodil, Hollyhock, all gone in an hour. Somebody said Parliament is shut down. It's war. He stopped laughing and burst into tears, just as Streety had thought he might. He seemed to be a very emotional fellow. I can't help you. They say everyone's to be off the streets by sunset. It was that Thornapple fellow who was saying it. Lord Thornapple seemed very calm. The Thornapple name frightened Streety, although at the moment he couldn't remember exactly why, but he also was confused by something else the man had said. Sunset? But it's already night. The Farisher shook his head, wiping at his eyes with the sleeve of his suit coat, smearing the dirty snow on his face even more until it looked like he was wearing a mask. Go home. Go to your children. He turned and began trotting down the street. In a few moments he was lost in the swirl of gray and white. I don't have any children, said Streety, but there was no one to hear him. He walked on for what seemed like hours. He forgot what street he was supposed to be on and stopped looking at the signs, stopped trying to remind himself. It was hard to see anyway. His eyes burned, and for some reason his lungs did too, just as they had in the days after his accident. He kept stumbling and and falling down, and each time it was harder to get up. But his friends were waiting for him back home. He clutched at his bag. His friends were waiting. In a dark street where the snow was not so thick, a small, narrow street, crisscrossed overhead, not with streaks of fire, but with washing lines, he crawled up onto a porch and fell against a door that had a smaller, round door in the middle of it, set about the height of his stomach. He didn't know where he was anymore, and he didn't know whose apartment or business this might be, but he remembered this kind of door. His friends had told him about doors like this with a hole in the middle. He slapped at it until he remembered to close his fingers into a fist, then went on knocking on the door, trying to remember what his friends had taught him about the right way to knock. 3 fast, 2 slow, 2 fast. Then do it again and again and again and again. The goblin that finally opened the inset round door and peered out did not say a word, but he did not close it again either. Instead, he watched Streety with wide, fearful eyes. Voices washed out from behind him, buzzing goblin voices raised in argument, as well as the familiar tones of the mirror talkers that had greeted Streety every night back home when he came in from the fields before he went away to work in the power plant. His mother had loved her mirror. My company, she called it. My friends. Friends. Help me, said Streety, and suddenly he was looking up at the goblin's face instead of down. He had fallen, somehow, and it was very hard to breathe, as though the snow was filling up his lungs. Hot snow that smoldered inside him and pushed out all the good air. Help me find my friends. They live under a bridge. Chapter 25. A Million Sparks. For long moments he waited to burn. There was noise all around him, distant shrieks and the disembodied voice of a hob, reporting danger and destruction, listless as a feverish child. But at the moment, it seemed to Theo, he was surrounded by and sunken in a deep and stunning silence. I'm going to die, was the only coherent thought, and so it seemed his only thought. I'm going to die. But after a while, he became aware that the silence was a kind of pall of shock, and that just as the world around him was actually filled with frantic noises, so his own mind was full of disconnected thoughts, flitting, squeaking, and colliding like startled bats in a sealed chamber. I'm gonna die here, in fairyland. Why had he sat waiting for this? Why hadn't he seen through Tansy before? Why had all the fairies he'd met been so certain that there wouldn't be a war? Well, they're all dead now, so they're probably feeling pretty stupid. Through all the disconnected fluttering in his head, he knew he was stuck in the middle of a moment of great change, a moment from which everything else could be seen as strands leading backward. He could only hope, but not quite believe, there might be strands leading forward as well. If I don't die. Gradually, through the dust and the sound of crippled beams creaking like the timbers of a storm-strained ship, he realized that if he was going to die, it might not be for many minutes or even longer. It was not his own floor that had been incinerated by that terrible winged shadow, but one farther up in the building. He was half flattened by bits of ceiling, but not crushed. He could feel his feet moving, his toes flexing when he tried them. But he could not expect things to stay this way very long. Smoke was already beginning to creep down from whatever hell had been created above his head. He could smell it, the weird odor of things burning that he could not identify, combustion without familiarity. Already he was having trouble taking deep breaths. If he stayed here, he wouldn't survive, but all else was vague and difficult. Theo reached out in his dust blindness and scrabbled at what was restraining him, but could make no sense of it by touch alone. He mopped at his eyes, turned the loose grit into a more general stinging slime of sweat and dust. There was dust everywhere, clouds of the stuff mixed in with the smoke. Something crawled across his hand, and he snatched it back with a shout, knowing, even as he did so, that it was ludicrous. As if any living thing could come close to the horror he'd just witnessed. 1,000 square feet of glass turned to liquid in an instant, flame like glowing acid. His shout turned into a helpless, heaving cough. Little dusty bugs were crawling all over him, or at least they looked like bugs, though they were almost perfectly round. Their legs stuck out in all directions. None was bigger than a silver dollar, but some were as small as confetti circles. One scrabbled across, another few inches from his hand, and he saw gold gleam where the dust was scraped away. Sitting on the floor as helpless as an infant, Theo suddenly realized that Hellebor's pale, calm face had been talking soundlessly in the back of his mind all this time. A sort of horror tape loop that didn't end, featuring the fairy lord's smile of infinite cruelty in the moments before the world caught fire. Hellebor was as empty as a ghost. Was that what a ghost was? Something that looked like a person but had lost all its kindness? But he was also powerful, more powerful than even poor dead Hollyhock had dreamed. Lord Hellebor and his allies had sent a reptilian monster to deliberately and cold-bloodedly kill everyone in that conference room, along with God knew how many other hundreds or even thousands in Daffodil House as well. And the destruction might not be finished. If he was to have a chance of living, Theo had to get out. What was pinning his lower body, he finally realized, was not part of the roof, but the dust-caked length of the conference table on which the mirror had sat, its legs gone, one end propped by debris. It was far too heavy for him to push it off, but by shoving at it until he was breathing in ragged gasps, Theo managed to get one of his legs loose. The whole limb throbbed, and he had to wait some time in the increasingly smoky dimness until he could use it to help shift the conference table a bit off the other leg, make enough space that he could turn his foot sideways, where it was hooked under the table's far edge. He rolled completely onto his side and wriggled until that foot was also free. Then he lay panting for a moment, until a coughing fit got him up onto his knees, retching and spitting bits of gray-white mud. He shrugged off his leather jacket and his thin fairy shirt, and tied the shirt across his nose and mouth like an outlaw's bandana. It seemed to keep out a little of the smoke. He was going to leave the heavy jacket behind and let sentiment be damned, but a piece of the flaming debris dropping down from above made him think again. Despite his exhaustion, he pulled the jacket back on. Where's the door? The room was getting extremely hot now, like an oven just starting to work. He had a brief vision of himself, baked as dry and powdery as the ash that covered him. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man. Oh, for God's sakes. Excuse me for a moment here. Shush. Forgot to turn that off. The room was getting extremely hot now, like an oven just starting to work. Theo had a brief vision of himself, baked as dry and powdery as the ash that covered him. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man. Finding the door seemed an impossible task. Debris lay everywhere, mountains of the stuff piled jaggedly to the roof. He couldn't make out where the walls were and which one was closest. Groaning, coughing, Theo started to crawl. Within moments, he put his hand down on someone else's hand. Numbly, he scraped away at the dust and fragments of ceiling, working his way up the arm to the face. He had enough time for a dull shock of recognition before Tansy opened his eyes behind his shattered spectacles. Help me, the fairy whispered. Theo looked at him for a moment. Hellebor didn't want me dead, he realized. He sent Tansy to get me out first, but it went wrong. Knowing that he was to have been spared was no comfort. The excisers wanted him alive, but probably only so they could torture him for some information they thought he had. Who is? Tansy blinked away blood. Help! Danger, murmured the hob from everywhere and nowhere. Attack! Theo just shook his head and crawled on. The idiot voice of the hob grew fainter and fainter, and then stopped at last as he made a painfully slow progress across the room. Collapsed structural elements were what made it difficult. The fallen beams and large pieces of wall and ceiling which hung down or were piled in front of him like abstract sculpture. But Theo dimly recognized that it could all have been much worse, although that wasn't much solace. The interior of a modern ferry building seemed mostly built of very light materials, which meant he was digging his way through piles of shaped, very strong glass, strips of wood, and metal, hammered almost as thin as gold leaf, all covered with a sifting snow of dust, instead of through concrete and cast iron. Still, by the time he had reached the door, he felt as though he had moved several hundred cubic feet of rubbish. He was sweating from the heat beating down from the burning floors above, but periodic showers of smoldering fragments from the dark spaces above made him glad he'd put the jacket back on. Once or twice he thought he heard Tansy moaning in the rubble behind him, but it wasn't as hard to ignore as he had thought it might be. Even with the hob silent, Theo's head was still full of yammering voices. It took him a few minutes to get the office door open when he finally reached it. The whole floor seemed to have gone slightly out of true. The corridor ceiling had also collapsed. As he made his way out on his hands and knees into the wreckage and smoke, he found bodies, all motionless and pretty clearly dead. Half a dozen fairies, all full size, who had been caught in the corridor when the ceiling had come down. He paused to peer through the floating dust, trying to decide which end of the hall was closer, but it was useless. He could only pick a direction and start crawling over and around the obstacles and past the silent victims, some of which were no more than feet or hands sticking out from under heavy wooden beams. The smoke was getting thicker, and the voices inside him were growing strong again, too, nattering away without much regard to what was really going on, like a bus full of querulous old people stopped by the roadside. He heard Cat talking about his many failures, Applecore calling him shallow. He heard Tansy's contempt and Lord Daffodil's scorn. They all want me to die. Waste of space. He felt sorry for himself because they were probably going to get their wish. But it hadn't always been that way. Everyone had always known he could make something out of his music. He had sung, and people had sat and listened or even stood and cheered. Even when he was back in elementary school, the teachers had sent home notes, put it on report cards. Theo sings like an angel. Or like a fairy. So was even that to be taken away from him? It turned out he wasn't special. He was just from another species. But Poppy liked my voice. She said so. And she's never heard anyone else but fairies. The smoke was getting so thick that he kept forgetting where he was, kept thinking it was fog, that he was on one of the hills back home in San Francisco, watching it roll down out of the west, or back in his cabin, with the trees turning misty and ghost-like outside. Simply to make some homely noise, he coughed dust out of his mouth and throat, and began to sing the first thing that came into his mind. But I'll sing no more till I get a drink, for I'm drunk today, and I'm rarely sober. He barely made a sound at first, just a hiss of air with words muffled by the shirt tied across his face. He found a bit of strength, coughed, and went on a little louder. I'm some rover from town to town. But I'm sick now, and my days are numbered. So come all ye young men, and lay me down. It was the old tune he'd sung to his mother as she lay dying. It didn't make a very brave sound. His voice was an unintelligible, muddy croak, and every syllable scraped his throat like steel wool. But it was a sound, something other than the internal drone of horror. He dug away at the wreckage and sang in a voice not much above a whisper. I wish I was in Carrickfergus, only for nights in Ballygrand. I would swim over the deepest ocean, my love to find. An ocean. It would definitely be worth drowning if he could do it in blessed cool water. Just open his mouth and swallow it down. He looked up, blearily aware that something had changed. He was having so much trouble clearing the 4-foot section of collapsed ceiling in front of him that he had failed to realize that what it was snagged on was a door handle. Door handle. Like Saul's revelation on the road to Damascus, it seemed blinding. Door handle, which meant door. A door. He had reached the end of the corridor. He managed to slide the sheet of ceiling material to one side before lifting it again, and this time he was able to get it upright, then push it away so that it toppled onto some of the other rubbish that had accumulated. Now he could see the actual handle covered with dust like a tomb artifact. His fingers curled around it. Opens in. That's what I need. Please, God, make it open in. If it opens in toward me, that means... What does it mean again? He fought to keep his mind from wandering away and leaving him alone. Right, that will mean it's an exit. The stairwell, probably, but if it opens away from me, it's another office. He couldn't bear to think about that much. He twisted the handle and pulled. It didn't open. For long moments he sat in the dust, completely devastated, his eyes blurring with gritty tears. He turned and pushed, but when that didn't work either, he succumbed to a twinge of hope. Maybe it's an outdoor, and it just jammed. He set his legs, grabbed the handle in both hands, and pulled hard. It didn't open, but he thought that he felt the smallest little tremor, something wanting to budge that couldn't quite. Delusion, a dying man's self-delusion. That was what it had to be, but he squatted again, got a grip on the handle, and then set one foot against the door frame. He pulled, straining for breath, almost screaming with the effort. The door popped open with one swift crunch like a bone breaking, and in that moment he felt he could hear a sudden choir of angels drowning out all the other voices in his head. The stairway was nearly as full of rubble, dust, and smoke as the hallway, but he could see a way down through the leaning timbers. Hundreds or even thousands of the little golden beetles were on the stairs already, pouring out of broken pipes and then forming themselves into semi-orderly lines that went nowhere, pooling against obstacles, driven by some instinct he could not understand. In fact, their headless determination reminded Theo of himself. He would have laughed, but his throat and lungs felt like they were full of singed wool. Only a couple of floors to the ground, he told himself. Don't lose it yet, man. He was halfway down the first set of stairs when something above him collapsed with a sound like a bomb going off, an impact that knocked him back to the floor. The dust clouds billowed with the pressure change, and his ears buzzed. A high, foul tone that didn't go away again and made him feel sick to his stomach. He sucked air through his improvised mask and waited to be crushed into jelly. But again, death seemed to be holding back, a giant skeletal fist trembling over his head. He clambered to his feet and began staggering down the stairs again. What am I doing in the middle of this? I'm a singer, a goddamn singer. I'm not even one of the guys that plays the guitar. As the ringing in his skull finally began to die down, new voices surrounded him, disembodied like the Hob, but not utilitarian, humming, chanting, even singing, 100 different keys, a cacophony. He couldn't help wondering if something had fallen on his head, and this was a symptom of brain damage or just some broken magic of the Daffodil House, spewing like a plumbing leak. At the bottom of 4 flights of stairs that each seemed a mile long, he found himself in front of another door. Now, to his slow astonishment, he realized he was hearing voices that originated outside his head. Real voices, loud and rough and fearful. He slipped and fell on the landing, then got up and pulled the door open, only to be nearly trampled by 3 dust-covered figures in the gray body armor of police constables, their hooded silhouette so bulky and distorted beneath their dusty cloaks that for a moment he took them for ogres. One of them grabbed him, a hard clutch on his upper arm that made Theo cry out even as he marveled at the existence of other living people. Beneath the hood and the dust, the constable was wearing prismed goggles like the compound eyes of a fly. A small shape holding a tiny glowing sphere hovered just above the constable's shoulder, dressed in a bubble mask and blast suit like a toy space alien. Theo guessed it was some kind of rescue sprite, one of Applecore's kin. "Is there anyone else up there?" the constable shouted. "Anyone alive?" "I don't know." The shirt over his face muffled his words, and he had to say it again louder. "Applecore," he thought suddenly. "My God, where is she?" "Right, get out!" His interrogator stirred Theo roughly through the doorway. "Go on, straight down the hall, and then up into the lobby." The constables pushed past him and started up the stairs. Tingling, almost hyperventilating with relief, Theo hurried along the hallway. He would live. Much of the rubble had been pushed against the walls, leaving the way clear. He would escape out into the air. He would escape the dust and smoke and the moaning phantom voices and the horror. Run away from this ruined place and keep running. Didn't matter where, until he could breathe, until he could sleep. The hallway branched. There was a sign in the illegible fairy script that he somehow could always read. "Lobby," it proclaimed, with an arrow pointing the way to life and freedom like the kindly hand of a guardian angel. The cross corridor sign read, "Daffodil House Tower." It also had an arrow. He paused without at first knowing why. Where had Applecore been when that horror had happened? Outside? Or at least that was what he wanted to believe. She must have gone outside. She must have. That was the message she had left for him before she went to the conference center. Before he went to the conference center. The sprite was no idiot either. If she had been anywhere out of the building, she would have seen that thing coming through the air, that terrible winged shadow, and she would have gotten the hell out of Dodge City. Of course she would have. But as Theo started into the corridor leading to the lobby, another thought struck him. Even if she did spot Tansy, she didn't follow him into the conference center where I was. What if she went upstairs to the big meeting instead? He stood at the place where the corridors crossed. If she went up there, she's dead, and there's nothing I can do. If she's outside, she may have lived, but there's nothing I can do until I get out there. Where else could she be? The comb. He didn't want to think about it, but he couldn't push it away. The comb underneath Daffodil House. He had no idea what had happened to the main tower, but he found it hard to believe that Hellebore and its allies would leave that proud, tall symbol alone. What if she had gone back to the comb? What if she needed help? No, it was foolish even to think about it. Go into another damaged building to look for a person who probably wasn't even there and would be almost impossible to find if she was. But even with his head buzzing and all his limbs achingly exhausted, Theo could not forget how she had flown against that undead thing like the world's bravest hummingbird, trying to save his miserable life with nothing but a corkscrew. And he could not forget her on the train, staying with him to the bitter end, huddled under his shirt, even as the constables and the horrid, slug-like hollow men approached. What had she owed him? Nothing. What did he owe her? Everything. Just head up that corridor to the lobby, you idiot, the sensible part of his brain told him. She's probably outside, and if she isn't, what could you do anyway? Shallow. The word jumped up like the blackest curse. Shallow. He could feel himself all surface, empty as a plaster statue. Heartless. Gutless. Better to be shallow than dead. What else do I have, though? What am I holding on to? I'm not even human. I'm some kind of unwanted rummage sale fairy. But she's my friend. He turned around again and stepped into the corridor with the Daffodil House Tower sign. Maybe the main tower had escaped the worst damage, he told himself, without quite believing it. It would have been the conference center Hellebore and those other sons of bitches really wanted, wouldn't it? All their enemies gathered in one place. Theo was shaken to dizziness by a sudden flashback of the meeting room collapsing in a gush of molten glass and billowing flames, of what must have happened to Lady Amelia Jonquil and Lord Hollyhock and even Spunky Walter working on a holiday. Because it was mostly empty of rubble, anyone who had been in the offices along the corridor between the conference center and the main tower had not lingered. The doors gaped open on either side, and the long hall was empty except for a fine haze of dust. After he had gone perhaps 100 paces, he reached a wider place, where 4 other corridors radiated out, making a 5-pointed star of hallways, not counting the smooth-sided vertical shaft that led upward from the crossing point to some kind of skylight window at the surface a dozen yards away. Excuse me for a moment. I'm not going away. Well, I am going away, but only for a moment because stuff is falling off my thing here. Okay. Got it. Where were we? After he had gone perhaps 100 paces, he reached a wider place where 4 other corridors radiated out, making a 5-pointed star of hallways, not counting the smooth-sided vertical shaft that led upward from the crossing point to some kind of skylight window at the surface a dozen yards away. Theo could see that it was dark outside now, a deep gloom pierced by beams of greenish-gold light filtering through the dusty murk. He didn't know whether the sun had actually set or the air outside was simply black with smoke. Either way, it was depressing and disorienting. He had no idea what time or even day it was, could not guess how long he had been struggling to escape. Only a few dozen paces beyond the star crossing, the corridor began to get hot, and Theo began to have a pretty bad feeling about what might have happened to the main tower above his head. Within 20 more steps, he was sweating profusely. Then the corridor dead-ended in a wall of gently smoking rubbish where the ceiling had collapsed. Oh my God, here too. He stood swaying. It seemed clear that the destruction above must be general and that it extended all the way down to this place, a floor beneath ground level, which meant that he had just forced his way into the most dangerous parts of another crippled building. But it's not as bad down here as where I was before. He clung to that thought. She might be trapped in there and doors are just stuck closed. No more time to stand around. It was painfully hot and seemed to be getting worse. He pulled his jacket sleeve over his fingers and gingerly touched the vertical rubble, looking for a safe place to apply pressure, but it did not move when he shoved it. He turned and retreated back up the corridor. Theo tightened the shirt over his mouth and wiped at his streaming eyes as he reached the 5-way crossing. He chose one of the 2 closest corridors and followed it until he again reached another spot where deadfall from the ceiling sent him back. Golden beetles with charred shells dropped from the crevices above, pattering on his shoulders and head, crunching underfoot when he walked. At least the humming, buzzing voice leak had finally gone silent, dying as the Hob voice had died. He chose another corridor and followed a succession of twisting passageways, struggling to keep himself focused on which direction was the one he wanted, but he hadn't had time to learn much about the main house tower's geography, and it was even more baffling from underneath. He stopped at another ragged wall of collapsed ceiling, heartsick and exhausted, but just as he was about to turn back once more, he saw that one of the open doorways, on the edge of the destruction, led to a short passageway and another door. Theo fought through the debris, protecting himself with the jacket as he pushed heavy pieces of beam out of the way, their charred edges still glowing in places. When he reached the other door, he found it was blocked by an obstacle on the far side, but at last he managed to shove it open. An arm fell across the gap as he stepped through. He almost tripped over it and fell down another set of stairs. The fairy corpse at his feet had been crushed by a large chunk of metal from above, which, after doing its murderous work, had tumbled on down the open stairway. The air duct, or whatever it was, had finally lodged about halfway down the steps, a black smudged clot of silver. Neither corpse nor fallen duct held his attention very long. Beyond and below, spread across the massive chamber and visible only because much of the smoke was being drawn up into the ruined ceiling, lay a bewildering panorama of devastation. Theo's first thought was that somehow, through some incomprehensible fairy magic, he had stepped right out of Daffodil House and was viewing the great complex's destruction from some perch high above it. It took a moment to realize that what he was seeing instead was an accidental reflection in miniature. The ceiling of the huge vaulted room that contained Daffodil Combe had come down in a tumult of flaming beams and shattered ducts and materials, smashing the center of the comb flat and setting the remnants on fire. Tongues of flame still leaped toward the ruined ceiling, filling the air with a swirl of ash and sparks, a storm of white flecks and orange glitter, so that the wide space seemed like nothing so much as a souvenir snow globe out of Hell's gift shop. Bodies were scattered everywhere, on the floor and in the rubble. A dozen or so were Theo's size, ordinary fairies who had been visiting the combe for work or social reasons, but the ghastly majority were pixies and sprites and other small creatures. Uncountable hundreds or even thousands of tiny bodies, burned black, translucent wings curled and crisped, so that what had been an entire city of speaking, singing people now looked like drifts of dead flies. But not all had died in the first destruction. Small cries of shock and pain filled the air, and Theo finally realized that what swirled through the chamber was more than bits of fiery ash, that the upper reaches were full of tiny, awkwardly fluttering shapes, some of them actually aflame, others just beginning to smolder, flying sparks, hunting madly for escape, but instead being sucked upward by the hot drafts. Others that had managed to stay below the updrafts were battering themselves against doors and walls as they died, blind and brainless. It began to seem like half of the million sparks that filled the air were dying fairies. Theo stumbled down the stairs, batting out the flecks of burning ash that settled in his hair and threatened his eyes, but he already knew it was hopeless. The heat was too intense. He could not stay in the burning room long enough to reach the worst of the destruction, let alone search in that horrid charred pile for one little body. He felt as though his eyes were coming out of his head, raw and so dry he could not even blink. The smell was terrible. He stopped when he reached the floor. A great piece of burning beam fell from the hole in the roof and clattered into the rubble of the combe, sending up a massive plume of sparks and flame. In the momentary glare, he saw that someone was kneeling on the ground not far away, someone his own size. Although debris had fallen very near and floating embers were settling on the figure's back, the fairy did not look badly burned. He was even moving, although very slowly, trying to pull himself across the ground. "Stay there!" Theo shouted, but it came out as a garbled yelp. He pulled the shirt away from his mouth so he could make himself understood. "I'll help you!" The figure's head came up and glanced around, half blinded by smoke. To Theo's astonishment, he recognized him. Cumber? He crossed the floor as quickly as he could, leaping over piles of burning debris, edging around those that were too large, struggling to stay upright, blocking any thought about what was crunching and smearing underneath his feet. He reached the Ferrisher's side and dragged him upright, ignoring the protests of his own agonized muscles. Cumber Sedge looked at Theo for a long, stunned moment without seeming to recognize him. "Come on! It's me, Theo! I'll help you! Can you walk?" My leg. Something fell on it." Cumber took another step and almost tumbled. Theo got under his shoulder. "Yeah, me too. You forget about it after a while. Hold on." They went staggering back through the smoke like some sickly two-headed, 3.5-legged monster. It was incredibly difficult for Theo to pull the ferry up the stairs. Cumber was nowhere near his size, but he was no thing of swan's down and dandelion fluff either. Something buzzed past Theo's face, whimpering and trailing sparks. The ceiling groaned, and another large piece shifted and then smashed down, throwing gobbets of fire past them as they struggled to mount to the landing. They killed everyone," Cumber said sadly. "Everyone?" "Not you and me," Theo said through clenched teeth. He was beginning to think he'd have to put the Ferrisher over his shoulder. "Not yet." The most difficult part was getting past the lump of metal that had killed the ferry at the top of the stairs. It had overbalanced since Theo had passed and rolled down another length of stairway and was now wedged crossways across the steps. Theo's only option was to climb past it himself, then lean back and try to help Cumber Sedge over the obstruction. As the Ferrisher was struggling to climb over the hot metal, the duct began to shift again. Cumber more or less leaped off the chunk of metal, gasping with pain, just as it shifted, slid, and then tumbled down the stairs to the fiery floor of the daffodil comb chamber. Theo just stepped over the corpse at the top of the landing, but Cumber Sedge balked, although he had been surrounded by charred bodies only moments earlier. "The rest of the roof is going to come down any second," Theo told him. "Step through this door or I'll slug you and drag you." He had actually raised his hand. He was coughing, and his eyes were so teary he could hardly see, but he was definitely going to do it when Cumber swallowed and stepped over the ruined body. "That was Drift Burdock," he said as Theo pulled him through the doorway. "I've known him since I was small. He worked with my mother. We're heading for the stairs." There was nothing else to say, really. Theo got under Cumber's arm, hobbling with him toward the star-shaped crossing. Behind them... Sorry, I lost my place here for a second. Theo got under Cumber's arm again, hobbling with him toward the star-shaped crossing. Behind them, something began growling in such a deep voice that for a terrified instant, Theo thought that the winged shadow, the dragon, had returned, had come down to the ground and forced its way into the vast room behind them. Then the walls of the corridor shook hard. The floor bounced, and the growl became a crackling groan. "The ceiling!" Theo shouted. He bent and got hold of Cumber Sedge as best he could, draping him awkwardly over his shoulder, then ran, his heart swelling in his chest until he thought his ribs would explode outward. He made only a dozen steps before there was a loud scraping squeal, followed by a titanic slam and a blast of hot air from behind them. The floor convulsed beneath their feet, and Theo pitched over, Cumber falling awkwardly beneath him. After a few dazed seconds, when the rest of the roof and walls had not come down on top of them, Theo dragged Cumber up and hurried him toward the only place that he knew for certain led up and out to safety. By the time they reached the stairs leading to the conference center lobby, smoke was roiling around their feet like swamp mist. Cumber, dazed and in great pain, wanted to stop to get his breath, but Theo would not allow it. The last moments went like a falling dream, like the instant between realizing you were about to be in a car accident and the first smash of metal on metal. As they staggered up out of the stairwell, Theo saw that the lobby was full of people, mostly hooded constables helping victims out toward the open doors. But all those other living creatures might as well have been in some kind of parallel dimension, a place that, although visible, had nothing to do with Theo Vilmos. His only thought, the one thing that kept his legs driving, was to get out of the building, to reach air and light, and to have nothing above his head but sky. A huge daffodil made of wood and gold leaf had fallen from the wall and shattered, flinging pieces everywhere. It seemed an exhausting insult, at this late point, to have to lift his weary legs over the fragments, but he did. They stumbled out of the doors to stand, stunned beneath black sky and the burning hulk of the main tower, the flames reflected 1,000 times in the windows of Daffodil House's other buildings. The shorter, slenderer tower of Narcissus House was standing almost untouched, just a few 100 feet away, although many of the windows were broken and some leaked smoke. The grotesque scene should have looked like something out of Dante. It did look like something out of Dante, but to Theo it was beautiful beyond description. It was the world again, the open sky. Things he had been certain many times in the last hours were now lost to him forever. They let hoarse-voiced constables shove them away from the door. Cumber disengaged himself and limped along, unsupported. Theo smelled air that didn't have smoke in it, or at least that had more air than smoke. Escape, he thought, blurry and tired, struggling to make something of his rattling thoughts. I'm out. I'm alive. Now what? He couldn't think of much of anything that mattered, except taking a long, cool shower and then sleeping for 100 years. And that's where we're going to stop tonight. So, as early in the book, excuse me for the runny nose and very reactive tear ducts. Part of it is emotion of reading those scenes. And part of it is just this weird inflammatory thing going on for me at the moment. But anyway, I apologize if I was dribbling snot. This is not the kind of website where you can lure people in with bodily secretions, I don't think. But who knows? I've never tried before. We'll see. Anyway, so thank you for putting up with that. Like the beginning of the book, that is, of course, one of the other very difficult parts to get through. Although Theo got out, I have to say, for those who haven't read the book, his troubles are just beginning. But they're not going to be just the same troubles over and over again. Oh, no. One of the great things about being a writer is you get to sit around thinking of new and different ways you can torture your characters, which is a very strange and paradoxical thing, that at the same time, while you're very strongly, what's the word I'm looking for? Again, my brain is just halva tonight, or something even stranger, blood pudding. While you are empathizing with the characters as a writer, at the same time, you're also going, now, what horrible crap can I do to them now? But it's got to be interesting horrible crap. It's got to be different horrible crap. So, if I had the guy shot a bunch of times, let's have him attacked by radioactive crickets, or whatever it might be. So it is a very bizarre thing to be a writer and to love your characters while you're torturing them. One last little story. It was very odd and interesting. Back when I was writing To Green Angel Tower, which for those of you who don't know it, was the final volume of the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series that began in 1988 or whatever with the Dragonbone Chair. But during the time I was writing the last volume of that book, To Green Angel Tower, which was this monstrously huge thing, I was going through a divorce. Not only was I going through a divorce, I was living in a horrid place, and I was, and by horrid, I mean there were so many fleas in the carpet that, literally, if I put my foot down, I could just see dozens and dozens of these things leaping up onto my legs. It was just disgusting, but it's just how it turned out at the time because, as it turned out, I was on my way to England to be with Deborah. So the long-term thing was good, but at the moment it was just horrid. And the divorce, I hadn't gotten divorced yet, but the separation, all that stuff, as anybody who's been through it knows, was horrid. And not just because there was anger and enmity, but also because there was the genuine sadness of having something that had been so much of a part of your life fall apart. Anyway, this all has meaning, which is why I'm running over. But it was very strange because as I was writing the worst part of what Simon, the main character, or one of the most main character, the protagonist, I guess, of the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn books, while he was going through his absolute worst bit, where he is captured by his enemies, he is hung almost crucifix style on a water wheel, he's literally spinning like St. Catherine, and just being tormented and no hope of escape or rescue or anything. And this just happened to coincide with the time where I was just miserable every day, just horrible. But the funny thing was that, not funny, haha, but funny, peculiar, was that I had actually planned all of this stuff ahead of time. In the sense that I knew what was going to be happening there, that I was going to be putting Simon through this terrible ordeal, these travails, but I had no idea what would be happening to me. So I was seesawing back and forth during that whole writing process, going like, is this what I originally intended, to punish Simon this much? Or, am I just so miserable that I'm taking it out on the character because, I want everything to suffer along? It was a very strange situation to have that interlinking, that weird overlap of how miserable I was feeling and how miserable I was making my character feel, and trying to achieve some kind of artistic objectivity about the whole process. So that's happened a number of times. I did not have that with this part with Theo. That came out afterwards when 9/11 happened. And as I explained in the beginning of the War of the Flowers in a little foreword or author's note or something, this was actually written before 9/11 happened. And it was, it was figured out in my mind, the whole thing with the dragon and the flame and the tower collapsing and blah, 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 was written long before the 9/11 actually happened. And of course, in the aftermath, everybody was, desperately trying to avoid in any way making light or, using that tragedy for their own, something of their own, for some look at me thing. And here I was with a major part of my book. And instead of a personal horror, like what I was going through when I was writing Simon's suffering, it was a national, international horror. And so I had to go back into it and write that part, which had been first drafted, as I recall, but it hadn't been finished yet. And go ahead and write that thing while I was listening to the reports and trying not to make it a one-to-one correspondence, but finding it very difficult to completely fence that stuff off either, because I decided, no, this was part of the story and it was always meant to be part of the story. And it's no disrespect or cruelty or, self-righteousness to it. It was a very crucial part of the story. As you will see, many things flow from this moment in War of the Flowers. Anyway, long, complicated thing, but it's very odd sometimes how these personal and private, even when you're writing fantasy and science fiction, it's very strange sometimes how these personal and private things can overlap and intermingle and sometimes even suffuse each other almost osmotically, almost invisibly, like water, like different kinds of water coming together. Anyway, so with that, oh my God, see, I've run over past the time. With that, I'm going to say thank you again so much. Lovely to see you. Thank you for joining me, all of you. A special hi and hello to friends I haven't had a chance to see here before, like Teresa and Nina. And I think I briefly saw my mother-in-law. Was that tonight? Yeah, I think she was up early or something. I don't know. Anyway, or up late. But if not, but it was great to see you all. So once again, be good to each other. Be good to yourselves. Be good to people you don't even know, because God knows we all need that right now. And I will be back next week. Same TAD time, same TAD channel. I hope you will join me then. And with that, I say, mwah, bonne nuit, bonne chance, auf Wiedersehen, and das vidania. Anyway, that wasn't really appropriate, but hey, what the heck. Domo arigato, that too. And for any Australian friends out there, cheers right, mate. And with that, I will say goodnight. So good night, and thank you.